On a Friday evening in April of 1964, a police officer chasing a speeding car in New Mexico stopped the pursuit, drove up a gravel track, and found something standing in an arroyo. His name was Lonnie Zamora. He was a sergeant with the Socorro Police Department. He was in uniform, on duty in a marked patrol car, and he was, by every account of the people who investigated him afterward, one of the least imaginative men you could hope to put in front of an impossible thing. What he reported that evening was examined by the United States Air Force. It was investigated under Project Blue Book, and when the Air Force finished with it, they filed it under a single word: unknown. Not hoax, not balloon, not misidentification. Unknown. 62 years later, that is still where it sits. This is a real case, and I am going to hold to the same rule I always do. Claims will be labeled as documented, as testimonial, or as disputed. On this one, the skeptical case is genuinely strong, and I am going to give it the full room it deserves. Let me start with the timing, because the timing is what makes this so hard to wave away. It is around 5:45 in the evening on the 24th of April, 1964, still daylight. Zamora is south of town, chasing a speeding car north along the highway. Then he hears a roar, and he sees a flame in the sky, to the southwest, some distance off. He estimates it at half a mile, maybe a mile away. Now most people, hearing a roar and seeing fire in the desert, would think about the sky. Zamora did not. He thought about a dynamite shack. There was a shed out that way where explosives were stored. In a mining and construction county, in 1964, a roar and a flame meant something on the ground had gone up. So he broke off the pursuit of the speeding car, radioed his dispatcher, a man named Net Lopez, and said he was going to go and look. Hold on to that detail, because it is one of the quiet load-bearing facts in this case. He did not stop chasing a speeder because he thought he was seeing a spaceship. He stopped because he thought somebody might be hurt. The track up to the arroyo was rough gravel. His patrol car could not make the grade on the first attempt, or the second. On the third try, he got over the rise. And then, about 150 to 200 yards away, he saw it. He described it as shiny and oval. His own words, when he was asked to compare it to a shape, were that it looked like the letter O, and the material, again in his words, was, quote, like aluminum, whitish against the mesa background, but not chrome. Not chrome. That is the kind of detail that does not come from a man who is inventing. It was standing on legs, and beside it briefly, he saw two figures in white overalls. Now here is where the popular version of this story and the actual record start to come apart, and I want to stay with the record. Zamora did not describe monsters. He did not describe big eyes, or grey skin, or anything of the kind. Asked what the figures looked like, he said they were, quote, normal in shape, but possibly they were small adults or large kids. Small adults or large kids. That is the entire description. A man saw two people-shaped figures in white at a distance for a moment and reported exactly that, and no more. He also described a marking on the side of the craft, a symbol. And I have to be careful here because the insignia is the single most argued over detail in this entire case. Published drawings of it differ from one another. There are claims that the version released to the public was altered and claims that it was not. What I can tell you honestly is this. He reported a marking. The drawings that circulate do not agree, and anybody who shows you one image and tells you that is the symbol is telling you more than the record supports. Then it left. He heard a roar again. He saw a flame underneath it, blue and orange, and the object rose and moved off and was gone. Zamora had, by this point, taken cover, and when it was over, he did what a police officer does. He got back on the radio. Now, this is the part of the case that skeptics have the hardest time with, and it is the reason this case survived when hundreds of others did not. Within minutes, Sergeant Chavez of the New Mexico State Police arrived. He asked Zamora what the trouble was, and Zamora, instead of telling him a story, took him to look at the ground. The brush was burning, not scorched, not blackened from some previous week. Officers arriving at that scene noted patches of grass and brush actively smouldering, and they noted shallow holes in the ground, which Zamora said were made by the object's landing legs. So set aside for a moment everything Zamora said he saw. Look only at what other people independently found when they got there. Something had been burning in that arroyo, and something had pressed into the soil. That is the flaw of this case, and it is why the Air Force could not simply file it and move on. Before we get to the explanations, it is worth understanding why a case like this was investigated at all, and why the machinery that examined it was built the way it was. By 1964, the United States Air Force had been formally collecting reports of unidentified objects for about 17 years. The program had gone through several names. By this point, it was called Project Blue Book, and it was run out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Its job in practice was twofold, and the two halves pulled against each other. Officially, it investigated reports. Practically, it also served to reassure the public that there was nothing to worry about. That second function mattered a great deal to an Air Force in the middle of the Cold War, whose actual anxiety was not visitors from elsewhere. It was Soviet aircraft, Soviet missiles, and the possibility that American radar and reporting systems could be confused or overwhelmed. So when a report came in, the institutional pressure ran in one direction: explain it, close it, move on. That is the context you need in order to read the words the Air Force eventually wrote about Socorro. This was not an organization looking for mysteries. It was an organization with every reason to find an answer. Here is where I raise my hand, because you should be raising yours. There are 4 serious explanations that have been offered for this, and one of them is very good indeed. I am going to give you all 4, and I am going to give the strongest one the most time, because that is the only honest way to do this. The first, and the weakest, is the mirage. The skeptic Stuart Campbell argued that what Zamora saw was almost certainly a mirage of the star Canopus. I will be blunt about the problem with that. A mirage of a star does not set fire to brush. A mirage does not leave impressions in soil that other police officers photograph and measure. Whatever else is true here, something physical happened in that arroyo, and an atmospheric trick of light is not it. The second explanation is more interesting. It has been suggested that Zamora saw a test of a lunar landing device operated by personnel from White Sands Missile Range. And that is not absurd. This was 1964. The United States was 5 years from putting men on the moon, and the machines being built to do it were strange, spidery things that stood on legs and came down on a column of flame. New Mexico was full of test ranges. A vehicle like that, seen at 200 yards by a man who had never imagined such a thing existed, could produce something very close to Zamora's description. The difficulty is that the case has been picked over for 6 decades by people highly motivated to find that answer, and no test record placing such a device in that arroyo on that evening has ever been produced. The third explanation is the one I take most seriously, and it deserves your full attention. The hoax. Socorro is a college town. It is the home of the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, and a hoax theory has been advanced by the skeptic Robert Schieffer, and notably supported by the man who was then the president of that institution, Sterling Colgate. Colgate's description of what he believed the object was is 4 words long, and it is devastating in its simplicity. Quote, "a candle in a balloon." Not sophisticated. Now think about what that would mean. Engineering students in a town where the police force is small and famous for nothing, building a stunt out of a candle and a balloon and a bit of theatre, and watching a story escape from them and grow for 60 years. It would explain the flame. It would explain the burning brush. It would explain why nobody has ever produced a test record for a lunar lander in that arroyo, because there was no lunar lander. And when the president of the local technical university says he believes his own students did it, that is not a fringe claim you can wave away. That is the strongest single piece of skeptical testimony in the entire case. The fourth explanation, and I include it mainly for completeness, came from the skeptic Philip Klass, who claimed the entire event was a plot by the municipal government to increase tourism. I will let that one sit where it falls. A serving police sergeant risking his career, a state police sergeant corroborating physical traces at the scene, and the United States Air Force investigating for months, all as a scheme to sell motel rooms in Socorro. It is not impossible, it is simply not supported by anything. So where does that leave us, honestly? It leaves us with a case where the physical traces are real, and where the best available conventional explanation is a student prank that has never been confessed to. And that last part matters more than it might sound. Hoaxes leak, that is the nature of them. They are done for an audience, and the pleasure of a hoax is in the eventual telling. 6 decades is a long time to hold a joke. The students who would have done this would be in their 80s now. Many of them would be dead, and not one of them, as far as the public record shows, has ever stood up and said, "That was us, and here is how we did it." That is not proof that it was not a hoax. It is a fact that sits uncomfortably alongside the hoax theory, and I would rather hand you the discomfort than tidy it away. There is another detail worth putting on the table, because it cuts against the tidy version of this story as well. Zamora was not the only person who reported something that evening. Accounts collected afterwards describe a tourist couple passing through who stopped at a service station in Socorro and mentioned a low-flying craft. The station owner, Opal Grinder, is the name attached to that account in the literature. I want to be careful with it because it is second-hand, and because the couple were never conclusively identified. It is not a signed statement, it is a story about a story. But it is the kind of thing that sits awkwardly with a student prank in an arroyo. A candle in a balloon does not usually get reported by strangers driving through town as something flying low over the road. I give it to you at exactly the weight it deserves, which is interesting, unconfirmed, and not something to build a conclusion on. Now let me tell you what the Air Force did, because that is the part of this case that is genuinely, officially strange. Project Blue Book was the United States Air Force's program for investigating unidentified flying objects. Over its lifetime, it examined thousands of reports, and the overwhelming majority of them were explained. Aircraft, balloons, planets, stars, weather, hoaxes. That was the outcome in case after case after case. The Socorro case was investigated. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who served as Blue Book's scientific consultant, was involved in it. And at the end of all that, the case was classified as unknown. I want to be precise about what that word means in this context because it is often oversold. Unknown, in Blue Book's system, did not mean the Air Force believed a spacecraft had landed. It meant that the investigation had failed to identify a conventional cause with confidence. But sit with it anyway. This was an organization with every institutional reason to close cases. It had aircraft records, weather data, test schedules, and the ability to make a phone call to any base in the country and ask what was flying that evening. And with all of that available to it, faced with a police officer's account and burnt brush and impressions in the soil, it wrote down, unknown. That is why this case is still discussed 62 years later, not because of the two figures in white, because the people whose job it was to explain it away could not do it. There is something else about this case that I think gets lost, and it is the thing that makes it different from almost every other famous sighting of that era. Most of the cases that fill the books are lights. A light in the sky, moving strangely. A light that stops, or turns, or splits in two. And lights are the easiest thing in the world to be wrong about. A light has no size you can judge, no distance you can measure, and no scale you can compare it to. Everything about a light is inferred, and inference under stress is where human perception fails worst. Socorro is not a light. Zamora reported an object on the ground. He reported its shape, its color, its material, its landing legs, and two figures standing next to it. He reported a symbol on its side. And then, crucially, he reported a location, a specific arroyo, which he could walk another officer to within minutes. That is a different category of claim. A light cannot be checked, a landing site can. And when other men walked into that arroyo, they did not find nothing. They found burning brush and marks in the soil. Whatever explanation you prefer, and I will come to the honest hedge in a moment, the case has that unusual quality. It left something behind. There is one more thing to say about the man himself, because his behavior afterwards is part of the evidence, whether we like it or not. Consider what a police officer in a small New Mexico town in 1964 had to lose. His job depended on being believed, A police officer is, functionally, a professional witness. His testimony puts people in jail. If the department or the district attorney or the town decides that this officer sees things that are not there, his usefulness ends. Reporting this cost him something, and it could have cost him a great deal more. And he did not do it for money. There was no book, there was no lecture circuit. He did not become a personality. By every account, Lonnie Zamora found the attention unpleasant, gave the same account when pressed, refused to expand it, and would have been happiest if the whole thing had gone away. That is not proof of anything. Sincere people can be sincerely mistaken, and a man can be honest and wrong at the same time. But it does remove one explanation from the table, and it is the explanation that accounts for a great many other famous cases, that the witness was building something for himself. Whatever happened in that arroyo, Lonnie Zamora got nothing out of it. Now the honest hedge, and then the part that keeps me thinking about it. We do not know what happened in that arroyo. A prank is possible, and a good prank would look very much like this. Zamora was one man, and one man's perception at 200 yards, in a moment of adrenaline, is not a measuring instrument. Human beings misjudge distance, size and time badly under stress, and every serious investigator, including the one sympathetic to this case, has to account for that. What keeps me from filing it away is the shape of the man's behavior, before and after. Before, he abandoned a traffic pursuit because he thought a shack full of explosives had gone up, and someone might be hurt. That is a man doing his job. After, he did not sell his story. He did not go on tour with it. By every account, Lonnie Zamora spent the rest of his life mildly irritated by it, wishing people would stop asking, and refusing to embellish a single detail. When you compare that to the arc of almost every celebrated UFO witness of the 20th century, the difference is impossible to miss. The story got bigger, he never did. We do not know. Hold it loosely. Here is where everything stands today. The Project Blue Book files are in the National Archives, and the Socorro case sits in them classified as unknown. The arroyo is still south of Socorro, and the town has never entirely stopped being the place where this happened. The drawings of the insignia still disagree with each other. Sterling Colgate's 4 words are still on the record, and so is the fact that no student has ever come forward to claim them. And Lonnie Zamora, who never wanted any of it, died having told the same story, without additions, for the rest of his life. So what stood in that arroyo? If it was a machine of ours, whose was it, and why has no record of it ever surfaced? If it was students with a candle and a balloon, why has nobody claimed the best prank in the history of American folklore? And what does it mean that the one agency with the power and the motive to explain this away wrote down the word unknown and left it there? A police officer stopped chasing a speeding car because he thought someone might be hurt. What he found instead is still, 62 years later, officially unexplained. That is not a small thing. That is a hole in the record, and it has a police report attached to it. One last thought before I leave this one alone. There is a habit in this subject of treating an unexplained case as though it were an answered one, as though unknown means confirmed. It does not, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make a better ending. But there is an opposite habit that is just as lazy, and it is more respectable, so it does more damage. It is the assumption that because most reports have ordinary explanations, all of them must, and that anything still unexplained is simply waiting for someone sensible to come along and tidy it up. Socorro has been waiting 62 years for that person. It has been examined by the United States Air Force, by professional skeptics, by scientists, by journalists, and by generations of researchers on both sides of the argument. The hoax theory has a university president behind it. The lunar lander theory has an entire missile range's worth of possibility behind it. And still, no test record has been produced, and no student has confessed, and the case sits in the National Archives under the word the Air Force chose when it ran out of alternatives. That is what this archive is actually for, not to tell you what landed in that arroyo. Nobody can honestly tell you that. It is to make sure that the fact of the hole in the record does not quietly close over, that 62 years later somebody still says out loud, a police officer reported this, other officers found burnt ground, the government investigated it, and the government wrote down that it did not know. Keep the hole open, that is the whole job.